following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Yo, Philly, how you's doing? Welcome to Philadelphia Baseball, past, present, and personal. I'm Bill Kashatus, your host on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. This week, we're going to turn back the clock to the early 20th century and look at the origins and history of Shibe Park, which opened in 1909 as baseball's first steel and concrete stadium. Located at North 21st Street and Lehigh Avenue, the stadium was constructed by William Steele & Sons at a cost of $301,000, which would be about $8.2 million today. Originally home to the old Philadelphia A's and later the Phillies, Shibe Park renamed Connie Mack Stadium in 1953 to honor the grand old man of Philadelphia baseball, Cornelius McGillicuddy. The ballpark hosted 8 World Series, all but one thanks to the A's, and 2 All-Star games, the first in 1943, the second in 1952. The final game was played there on October 1st, 1970, as the Phillies were planning to relocate to brand-new Veterans Stadium in South Philadelphia the following spring. 6 years later, the rundown old stadium was demolished. To give us a more in-depth understanding of Shibe is this week's guest, Bruce Kuklik, emeritus professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania and author of To Everything a Season, Shibe Park and Urban Philadelphia, published in 1991 by Princeton University Press. Welcome to the podcast, Bruce.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
Bruce, you've taught courses and written highly acclaimed books on the political, diplomatic, and intellectual history of the United States, and also in the philosophy of history. Why would you do a book on baseball?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. When I told the chairman of my department that was going to be my next project, he looked at me and he said, "Your brains have been fried." So in an academic environment, this wasn't the easiest thing in the world to do. And it actually came about in a funny way. I was working on a book on the presidents and wanted some pictures. And particularly, I wanted pictures of Kennedy. And I went down to the Temple University Archives, Temple being the big urban university in Philadelphia, and looked through their archival pictures on Kennedy. And as you would imagine, there weren't any there because the reporters, after Kennedy's assassination, had stolen all the pictures of the president, except for one. There was a picture of Kennedy at Shibe Park. I still don't know when it was taken, whether he was president or not, or whether it was just a quick stop through the city at some point. But I thought to myself, gee, here's this guy at the ballpark that I used to go to. I wonder what its story was. And I started looking for other pictures of the old ballpark, and I slowly found myself kind of grabbed by the story of this park. And it's kind of interesting as an idea because you don't usually think of buildings as having a biography, a history. They're just there. But once you start researching this kind of stuff, you find, or at least I found with Shibe Park, that it had this whole history of its connection to the ball clubs, to other sporting events, to the community around it, to the ball players who came and went. So it turned out to be a kind of fascinating kind of enterprise that kept me involved for 5 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, many years ago when I was beginning my baseball writing, you were very kind to sit down and talk with me about your experience in researching the book, and I point to that book as the inspiration for 3 books that I have written, 2 on the A's and 1 on the Phillies in the 1960s. It's just a brilliant book, and the Temple Urban Archives is a real gem too.
Absolutely.
for photographs as well as documents.
Yes.
Bruce, I want to talk with you about the very beginnings of the stadium. The A's of the American League were established in 1901 by Connie Mack and Ben Shibe.
Right.
Mack, a former player for Pittsburgh, had already managed in the Western League.
Right.
Shibe was the president of the Philadelphia-based Reach Sporting Goods.
Right.
The team's first ballpark was a ramshackle wooden bandbox called Columbia Park, which
Right.
could hold as many as 20,000 in its 9,500 feet wooden bleachers.
Right.
So why build a new stadium?
Well, there's several reasons. First of all, I think Shibe and Connie Mack really saw the possibilities for baseball as a business that few other people did at the time. I think they realized that the interest of people in professional sports, the real interest of people in watching very skilled baseball players at work was increasing. America's gross national product and the average wage for people was growing, so there was more money around for amusements. If you look at the United States as a whole, this is a period in which the entertainment industry is growing. It's just at the start of the period when movies the silent movies become really important. So I think Shibe and Mack saw the main chance. And what they thought was, if they could build what was then regarded as a baseball palace, an all concrete and steel stadium, which was huge and stately in comparison to what had gone before, that they would attract more and more fans, which they did, and that they could not become rich men, but become very, very successful businessmen, baseball entrepreneurs. I don't want to say that they're the precursors of guys like George Steinbrenner, but it's pretty close.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that is so wonderful about your book is that it's not just a study of Shibe Park, but a study of urban Philadelphia and
right.
the changing demographics over
right.
The time period, the life of that park. And every bit as fascinating to me is, that area and the demographics of it where the stadium was built. Now, obviously, we know Shibe Park was named after the A's president, Ben Shibe,
right.
Located on Lehigh Avenue between 20th and 21st Streets, but it straddled the neighborhoods known as Swampoodle and Goosetown. And I love
right.
this description you give in your book. You wrote that this was an undeveloped area of, quote, high clay bluffs, rain-washed gullies, quagmires, open fields, even ponds where chickens pecked and pigs rooted when the A's broke ground there in 1908. Why build on such a primitive site, Bruce?
Well, we can't do it on the radio, but I have a lot of maps, as you know, in that book, and one of the most interesting ones, or the most interesting one for me, is my reconstruction of what that area looked like around 1900. Because although the immediate neighborhoods, and they weren't even neighborhoods, I mean, they had these vague boundaries and they had these kind of colorful names, but there aren't many people living around there. It's really close to rural. But if you look at the main highways that traverse this place, they're all going out to two different venues. One, believe it or not, are graveyards. An awful lot of Philadelphia graveyards are out in what I would call the near northern part of the city. And believe it or not, on weekends, a form of entertainment for a lot of people would go visit their relatives or friends who were buried in the graveyards. They were quiet, beautiful places that you could, have a picnic lunch or something like that, and they were, of course, free. In addition to that, because the roads took people out to these popular the graveyards, you also had amusement, various kinds of amusements, like not horse racing, but various kinds of racing of bikes, for example. Bike racing was a big thing, and they would put the bike race tracks out there next to the graveyard. So there were places along the routes that made these very popular and accessible to people. And again, Shibe and Mack say, look, where are we going to put this new palace of baseball? We're going to put it in an area which is already known and frequented by people as a place of amusements. So they built it there. They also knew there's a kind of interesting footnote about there was a hospital for contagious diseases across the street from where the park was built, which made the property around this area very, very cheap. And they learned that the hospital was going to be torn down. So what they did was to buy up a city block of property that would, at a very cheap price. And then, of course, when the hospital was torn down, the surrounding area, the land values went up, and ultimately came to be a kind of thriving working class industrial neighborhood. But they were in again on the ground floor, and a very shrewd, intelligent businessman.
Yeah, when I read this part of your book, it reminded me of the criterion for building Ebbets Field in Brooklyn, because that area was a major transportation hub too.
Right.
Now,
That's
it doesn't
right.
seem like Shibe or that neighborhood had become that yet, but you do point out in the book that it was much more it would be easily accessible for the fans.
Yeah,
is that correct?
That's right. It was at the time. Now, as time went by, it became less so, but it was, when they built it, accessible to major highways and traffic routes in the city. And this was the beginning of the automobile age, so you didn't have to worry about crowded city streets, at least initially. And in fact, one of the things that I found most people don't know is that when the park was built, there were huge, more or less underground basement-level parking lots there.
Wow.
That in which people, kind of upper crust of the fan base would come in automobiles, and they would just park right more or less under the ballpark.
Amazing.
Whereas other people would come by bus or trolley or even horse-drawn carriages at first.
Amazing. Wow. Well, it must have been interesting because of the primitive and crude area in 1909 to have this very first concrete and steel stadium in the nation built, and it looked like a French Renaissance castle.
That's right.
I want to read what the Philadelphia Public Ledger said. You wrote this, you quoted in the book. They called it a palace for fans, the most beautiful and capacious baseball structure in the world. And American League President Ban Johnson echoed that sentiment, calling Shibe the greatest place of its character in the world. Bruce, particularly for our younger listeners who never even saw this park, can you describe the specific features of the stadium that gave it that kind of breathtaking appearance?
Yeah, I would say a couple of things about that. First, the main thing that that one feels or notices. And there are guys now who have kind of using computer-assisted design who you can take a walk through the stadium in a way on a computer screen now if you can Google the right websites. But basically by the 1920s, at the height of the I would say the height of the fame and the height of the fame of the stadium, you have a built-up urban area outside, and you walk in through the main gate, and you walk into a kind of a concrete set of hallways which you go through, but then they lead you out either to the home plate area or the dugouts on first and third base. And all of a sudden you're confronted with this massive green lawn, which was very meticulously cared for by the Shibe Park gardeners and landscapers. And that is the thing that most people remember about the park. They can't tell you, well, there are a couple of distinguishing features which we'll talk about, I think, later, one of them called the spite fence. But basically what they remember is kind of all of a sudden coming out into this huge expanse of bright green lawn, which throws them back into a feeling that they're in the country or in a rural area. And I think there is something to this general idea that baseball has this kind of rural character that carries people back to a different time and a different feeling about the United States. So that I would say is the main memory feeling that people have, the main visual experience. If you want to look at it more objectively, what was the place like? There are two places that are still left that are reminiscent of Shibe Park, and of course, you know, one is Fenway and the other is Wrigley. And I would say that of all of these classic stadiums, I mean, there are a lot of them. It's Crosley Field, Sportsman's Park, Griffith Stadium, Ebbets Field, the Polo Grounds. I would say the two that are left are the two most interesting. Fenway, I think, was certainly the funkiest field, and Wrigley was the most beautiful. And Shibe Park wasn't as funky as Fenway, and I'd love to be able to tell Philadelphia fans that we had a better field than Wrigley, but it wasn't. But the general character of the fields was the same. I mean, they were smallish, 38,000 max. Although for the time people found that they were distant from the ball players and everything. From the point of view of today, you are much closer in, much more part of the action at the fields. So there is a sense that you're in I don't want to say it was like going to the opera for the working class people who came to these games, but in a way it was the equivalent. I mean, they didn't have the money to go to high class theater. They didn't have the money to go to the opera or musical concerts. But what they had was a different form of mass entertainment, which was in some way, because of the gorgeous nature of this park, which just is elevated for them. And you can't, it's something that's really hard to recapture. I mean, just the fact that you could go into the stadium, for example, and buy food, drinks, you can actually get your popcorn or Cracker Jacks or There was soft drinks. There wasn't liquor for a long time. But there was this familial atmosphere which was at the same time luxurious. This was a new experience for people.
Well, it was a new experience for me when I was 6 years old.
Yeah,
and
right.
went in it for the first time. And your description of walking, down the runway, and all of a sudden this beautiful green expanse. And you know why they call it, the Green Cathedral. And you know what I remember? What is so distinct, I could even feel it, smell it today, is that peculiar combination of cigarette smoke, stale beer.
Yeah, you were a later guy. That's why they had stale beer. That's right.
Yeah,
and the grass, and the grass. It was
and the grass. And you also. I'm glad you spoke about Fenway and Wrigley. I go to those places as much as I can. They are beautiful parks. I envy Boston and Chicago, those fields. And I really wish we had something like that here.
No.
But you've as in all those old parks, there were idiosyncratic field dimensions, and you've written that the deepest part of center field was a square corner, 515 feet from home plate.
Yeah.
It was 378 to the left field foul marker and 340 to right field.
Yes.
And, that seating capacity, which expanded over the lifetime of the stadium, initially was, I think, 23,000, and yet still fit overflow crowds in by roping off the left field area in front of the wall. Now, Bruce, how did those field dimensions and the seating capacity compare with other ballparks at the time? Much bigger or about the same?
Well, initially, when you gave the initial dimensions, that was, I think, much bigger than most other places. But they very quickly contracted the dimensions. Mainly because they learned, just like, in fact, I was just in Clearwater last week seeing the Phillies get their rear ends kicked by the Yankees.
My sympathies.
And I was struck by the attempts to I'm sure your people listening will love this kind of stuff, but basically the Phillies were playing the Yankees in Clearwater at the Philly Stadium, but they play with a DH, even though they're playing in a National League park. And it's obvious to me the reason they do it is that they know people like offense. And Shibe and Mack very quickly learned that if you had a lot of offense, that would attract more fans. And one way to get offense is to bring in the outfield. So you increase the chances of home runs. Home runs were rare enough; they were impossible if you had a 500 foot dimension. They were a lot easier, even though they were rare, if you have 330 feet. And one of the things that's interesting about old-time baseball is that because it's called the dead ball era, as you know, because home runs were so rare, people would be absolutely thrilled if they could be at a park when a home run was hit. I mean, as you know, one of the leading leading slugger of the era played for the Philadelphia Athletics, Frank Home Run Baker. And he would have, like 8, 10, 12 home runs a year to lead the American League in home runs. But the beauty or the power of a home run was overwhelming to people. And I think that more than anything made Shibe and Mack contract the dimensions of their ballpark.
Now, something that is very interesting to me. It almost seems, now I don't know if it's coincidental or not, but the Phillies seem to have taken a page out of Connie Mack's book here. Usually what happens is you get a new stadium and then you build the winner. Well, that was pretty much the case with Shibe, because the stadium was built in 08-09, and the A's won American League pennants in 1910, 11, 13, and 14.
That's
so
right.
then Shibe hosted the World Series in those years.
Right. That's right.
But that achievement also created a 25-year dispute with the residents who lived on 20th Street across from the park. Now, I never knew about this until I read your book back in 1991. During the World Series, those residents erected rooftop bleachers and sold seats to the fans who could not get inside the park. And because of the short right field fence, the fans on those Wildcat bleachers had a clear view of the playing field, and that cut into that.
Right. Hold it a second, Bill, but just so your listeners understand. A short right field fence, it was short in terms, it was like 330 feet, but it was low. It was only, the fence was 10 feet high, so if you were on a rooftop in a house across the street, you could see right over into the field and get a great view of the game.
And your book, in the book, you have photographs of the Wildcat bleachers, and you could see that very low right field fence. I mean, it's amazing. When we did the A's exhibit in 1999 at the Chester County Historical Society, we just blew that one whole scene up, and it was one of the most interesting visuals in that exhibit. So. But the point here being, this cut into Mack's profits. So
it cut into the profits as soon as the team stopped its winning ways, and they had to work to fill the stadium. If it's just an overflow, I mean, if he's got 30,000 seats and he sells them all, and you have another 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people sitting on the roofs, it doesn't hurt his pocketbook.
Right.
If you only have 20,000 or 15,000 people coming out to the ballpark, and 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 of them decide to go up on the roofs of the houses across the street for 15 cents instead of coming into your ballpark for a quarter or 50 cents, then you got problems.
Right.
And this is a favorite topic of mine because, I mean, I'm sure if you've gone to Wrigley, they still have a very, very upgraded version of those seats on Waveland Avenue, which is the street outside the outfield of Wrigley Field.
They do, but now the club owns those. The Cubs own those.
Not
buildings.
all of them. Not
really?
all of them. No, there's some on
the fire company's one of them, but
there's one to the I guess it would be in left field. I know there's a big one in left field because it gets rented by private businesses, like they'll have a day at the ballpark, and they'll pay the owner of the building $100 a person for a seat. But what's interesting about the Wrigley Field thing is that the ownership of the Cubs also had a big fight and threatened to put up a wall, and there was an arcade that they wanted to do and everything like that. And they didn't do what Mack and Shibe finally did, which was just to build a fence. What they did was to negotiate with people and buy a lot of the buildings, so they avoided this kind of conflict that happened in Philadelphia. And if you go back, this might be the last 5 or 10 years when the Cubs were working this out with the neighborhood. There are all sorts of citations to what happened in Philadelphia. I mean, Philadelphia for the Cubs was a bad example of how to do this. So I guess now, what I should say is for your listeners that what happens is that Connie Mack and Shibe basically argue with the neighborhood, let's say almost 20 years or 15 years from 1915, 16, 17 up until the early 1930s. I mean, there's a constant kind of painful series of complaints on each side. We're working class people. We love the A's. We love the neighborhood. We're just trying to make a couple of extra bucks. And then there are the baseball owners who are saying, you're taking money out of our pocket. How can you expect us to be a successful business if you're siphoning off money that should be ours? And the problems between the neighborhood and Connie Mack reach a critical point in the early 1930s, which is the period of the American Great Depression. And at that point, the bottom falls out by 1933-34. The bottom falls out of the finances of the Philadelphia A's, and it's Connie Mack. It's hard to know who is more responsible, Shibe or Mack. My feeling is it was Mack who says we're going to put up this fence. And what he does is to add 20 feet to this 10-foot fence, or some 20, 25 feet, which means that when you sit on the roofs, you can't see anything. Mm-hmm. In fact, I just saw somebody has there are pictures, movie pictures that were taken of the company putting up the steel fence.
Really? I'd love to see that.
Yeah. No. Well, we can talk about it later, but I know how you can get hold of those pictures, and they're really interesting because you see it's kind of what's this? I've forgotten the name for the kind of steel it is. I mean, it's not very heavy or thick, but all they cared about is that it went up high enough to block the view of the people. And it left lasting animosity in the neighborhood. And kind of there's one really interesting political aspect to it, which is that the neighborhood tried to stop Connie Mack from doing this, and there was a lawsuit that the neighborhood actually would be called a class action case today, which they lost to the Philadelphia Athletics. And their lawyer was Richardson Dilworth, who was later a very famous mayor of Philadelphia in the 1950s. In fact, he was district attorney, he was mayor, he was head of the school board, a very prominent Philadelphia politician, a Democrat. Well, if you know anything about the Shibe Park area, it was working class, and they were like, you look at the election results, and that area, votes like 95% Democratic, except that when poor Dick Dilworth ran for mayor, he lost those precincts because 20 years after the lawsuit, the neighborhood remembered that he had, from their point of view, done them dirty and worked for Connie Mack. So these baseball memories, they go back a long time.
They got memories like white elephants, and like this fight fence, those voters fighted Dilworth. Wow.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, the A's were not the only baseball club to play at Shibe,
No.
as your book points out. Beginning in 1919, the area's Negro League teams played there.
Right.
That would mean the Hilldales from Upper Darby, the Backrack Giants from Atlantic City, the Hometown Stars.
Yep.
In 1938, the Phillies finally moved out of their dilapidated home of Baker Bowl and played at Shibe, tenants of the A's. And obviously those Negro League teams and the Phillies were able to use the stadium when the A's were on the road.
Right.
What were some of the most memorable games at Shibe during those years, Bruce?
Let's see. My favorite. Oh, I got to. Well, this will be from. You want to when they get other renters and users, occupiers come in. I would say from the 1920s on.
Right.
There is there's a World Series game in 1929. I think it's the fourth game, but you can correct me when the A's are behind the Cubs in the World Series 7-0. And they came back and got 10 runs. It's really, it's an extraordinary comeback that the A's had.
Yep.
There were some Negro League World Series games in the early mid 40s, which featured a lot of guys who I think would have been stars in the major leagues and who played some terrific baseball there. There are two other sets of games I want to mention. One is the Whiz Kids from 1948 to the early 1950s. They won the National League pennant in 1950. I'd like to say those games were memorable, and they were, except that the Yankees swept the Phillies in 4 games, some of which were played at Shibe Park in 1950. But still, Robin Roberts, who was a terrific big right-handed pitcher, pitched some magnificent games there. Mm-hmm. And then my all-time favorite happened in 1952 at a game I attended as a very little boy. And I'll tell you the story of it, although I don't remember very much about the game. Right as he was retiring, Connie Mack tried to put together a last team that would be a contender and perhaps a dynasty. And he came close, but he didn't succeed. But he found and developed a left-handed pitcher, Bobby Shantz, who was about 5'8", and who had several years of really spectacular pitching. He won the MVP of the American League, and I think it was 52, when he had a record of 24-7. And that year, at least, I was taken to his 20th game, his 20th victory that year.
Wow.
And all I remember is being pulled by my dad through this huge crowd. And when I did the research on the game, on all of Bobby Shantz's appearances, it was a period of declining attendance for the A's, except whenever he pitched, the attendance jumped to 3 times what it was normally.
I'd heard that. It was like Carlton.
Yeah,
it was like Carlton and the Phillies in 72.
Yeah. And so my memory was correct, because all I remember is being pulled through this huge crowd. And then I would say, let's see, the Phillies, the A's leave the city in 54. The Phillies become the sole occupants of the stadium. I would say the next period of really interesting baseball there occurs in the late 60s. There's the great collapse of the Phillies in '64, which a lot of people know about. But in addition to that, there's the appearance in a Phillies uniform of Dick Allen, who was a tremendous, colossal home run talent, a very troubled and difficult guy, but a real natural home run talent. Some of the home runs that I saw him hit and that my brothers and father also saw him hit were really extraordinary. He used to park some of them there. If you look at the old ballpark in basically center field, there's he could park the ball over the center field roof. I mean, and some of them were acknowledged to be something like 500 feet. So he was, I would say that it's his appearance in the mid-late 60s that is the last really extraordinary events that take place in that park.
Now, we talked a little bit about the fact that your book is really just as much about the urban history of Philadelphia as it is of Shibe Park. So tell us, how did the demographics and culture of that North Penn neighborhood where Shibe was located, how did that change over time? You mentioned initially it was working class. What happened to it as the 20th century unfolded?
Well, let me go back with a couple of other things. That first of all, there's no liquor sold at the ballpark for a long time, and the same thing is true at Forbes Field in Pittsburgh, the other major league ballpark in Pennsylvania. And one of the interesting things about both Forbes Field and Shibe Park is that the ownership of both of the franchises, the Pirates and the A's and Phillies, basically are the leading groups trying to ease up the liquor laws in the state of Pennsylvania. For a long time, as well, you still know today, people who are Pennsylvanians, we can't get our liquor like everybody else in the United States. We have things called state stores. That is, the sale of liquor is controlled by the Pennsylvania state government. That was true to a much, much stricter extent back in the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s. And if you want to know how the liquor laws finally eased up for Pennsylvanians, the place to start is to look at the lobbying of the people who own the ball clubs. That's one way that you can see the way in which the ballparks are involved in the culture of the city and state. I'll give you another example of that. Baseball stadiums were notorious at the time for gambling. We still don't have any. We still have minimal legalized gambling in the state of Pennsylvania is still an issue. Illegal gambling. One of the central places that illegal gambling takes place is at the ballpark. And if you go there even today, you'll see people bet on is this pitch going to be inside or outside? Is it going to be a strike or a ball? It's 10-1 that the guy will get a single on the third pitch or something like that. All of that went on in a much more shady way at the ballpark, and you find that the whole issue of gambling in the state becomes localized by what goes on at the ballpark. So there are a lot of ways in which the general culture of the city, of the state, and the United States is kind of refracted through what happens at ballparks. In addition to that, and this gets to exactly, I hope, what you wanted me to talk about, which is the changing demographics of the neighborhood.
Right.
This was it starts out there's nothing there. It very soon is built up as a working class neighborhood. It's very close to a whole series of Philadelphia industries which are located along Hunting Park Avenue, which was somewhat to the north of the ballpark. So you have people living around the ballpark who are working nearby. It may be a trolley ride away. If you know your Wrigley Field neighborhood, it had something like the feeling of Wrigley. I mean, you have a successful, thriving, working class, which is very proud because it's living around the ballpark, which is a spot that is known all over the city. It gets there's a lot of business and traffic, and it's a kind of exciting, vibrant place. That's at one level. At another level, you have all of these mixed ethnic groups competing. You have Irish, Italians, Polish. You have a small contingent of Jews, and some kind of upper class Tony Protestant types who kind of get involved in the kind of nasty street level politics. So in addition to this vibrant ethnic working class, you have all the subdivisions within it with a lot of conflicts and I wouldn't say gang violence, but a lot of ethnic rivalry, certainly. By the 1950s, the neighborhood really has become run down, and it's at the same time that the suburbs are opening up in the northeast of Philadelphia, and then to some extent across the river in New Jersey. And what you see are two things happening, which are separate but somewhat related. A lot of these white working class people want to move out of their houses to bigger, more spacious, and even in some cases less expensive Levitt townhomes in the suburbs. So you see the white ethnic working class moving out. The African American community, the black community, which has been basically as the real estate red line, they call it, in near North Philadelphia, when all these houses go vacant, move into basically deteriorating houses around the ballpark. And racial politics being what they are in the United States, what happens is that a lot of the baseball fans who are white stop wanting to go to the Phillies games. I mean, there's a sense that it's dangerous. There's racism involved. People are just fearful. One of the reasons why the Phillies have Dick Allen as a player is to attract a more racially diverse audience. It basically doesn't work in Philadelphia, just like it doesn't work across the country. So all of these ballparks that had come to define Major League Baseball from 1900 to 1950, they're all demolished or vacated. New ballparks are built, which are more in the suburbs, more close to superhighways, less integrated into an urban neighborhood. We really lost something when this happened, which is one of the reasons why I think Fenway and Wrigley are such kind of shining examples of how baseball could be more integrated into an urban neighborhood rather than being as like in Philadelphia with both the vet and Lincoln Financial Fields are, they're not in a part of the city, so far as I can tell. I mean, they're just out there, and that's become the model, I think, for most places.
You're right, and we do lose something of that because they're not really part of the fabric in the day-to-day life of the city. I mean, we look at the Eagles, and this Eagles team in particular. The Eagles just generally, as a professional franchise, have captured the hearts because let's admit it, Philadelphia is a football town.
Yeah,
and you could gauge the pulse of the city on a fall Monday morning, depending upon what the Eagles have done, won or lost.
That's right.
But your comments about the racial politics and how the demographics of the neighborhood changed really reinforced to me that, baseball is a business, and the Carpenters were not making the money there because they couldn't attract the fans. They couldn't attract a racially diverse base. A lot of blacks who lived there by the 1960s felt that they were distant. They had nothing to deal with baseball.
That's right.
Basketball was becoming their game.
Yes.
And the crime rate, the white flight. So the Phillies had to move out of there, or at least they felt they had to move out of there. Now, Bruce, that last game on October 1st, 1970, did you attend that game?
No, I didn't. Actually, I had a very good. Remember, I told you I started talking to you about my chair,
right?
My chairman of my department, who said my brains had been fried. Well, he finally admitted he changed his mind because he went to that last game, and he actually took a hammer and some wrenches and helped rip out some of the chairs. And God bless him. In fact, I'm going to have lunch with him in a couple of weeks. He changed his mind, and at one point he gave me this chair that he ripped out of Shibe Park. So I have a chair from that night, although I wasn't there myself. I want to say, Bill, let me come back a second about this, the way in which the contemporary parks are not located in the city. The link is all right for me. It's and it's defined as one of these retro parks, right? But it's not in a neighborhood, and that makes a difference. And I was struck by this with the Eagles' victory, and then the parade. Because what they do, they know, in some way, they know that it's the city that's important. Where was the parade? The parade was not, they didn't use the Eagles Park, right? They didn't have a huge ceremony there. They marched up Broad Street right into the heart of the city.
Right.
They recognize that it's the city that is the kind of heart and soul of these professional sports teams. I think, and that was telling for me. We live downtown, and you didn't have to be a genius to see what was happening to the city.
And you're absolutely right, and I think this is why Bill Giles and company really courted the Fairmount neighborhood to try to get the ballpark there. It would have been ideal.
That's right.
I think more so than football, baseball really is part of, I think, the American urban culture.
Yes,
and
that's
it
right.
really needs to be in the city. But as you said, we are kind of like what North Penn was. When Shibe Park was started, it was like the playground area of the city on the outskirts, and that's pretty much what South Philly has become.
That's right. That's right.
I want to get to this issue of why the old stadium was demolished, and this really relates to what we've just been talking about. 20 years after that, what was left of Connie Mack Stadium was demolished, there was a new baseball park building craze, and fans had tired of the sterile concrete oval-shaped multiple sports stadiums.
Yeah.
They longed for the old ballparks of the early 20th century. And if you remember, Cleveland built Jacobs Field, where the Indians play, Camden Yards, where the Orioles play. They were among the first new kind of retro baseball stadiums to incorporate the classical look. Now, ironically, when the Phillies began planning for their new ballpark along the same lines, PNC Ballpark or Citizens Bank Ballpark, they tried to find the inner city site, which you're just talking about.
Right.
There was also a desire to incorporate many of the idiosyncratic features of Shibe Park in the new stadium.
Right.
Had the city just left Connie Mack Stadium alone instead of demolishing it and found another use for it, the Phillies could have had that inner city ballpark, maybe not right there, but, you know, buildings are dismantled and put back together again. They might have salvaged certain features like the tower, you know, the great tower of that park at the intersection of 21st and Lehigh, or the brick facade, and incorporated those features. You know, why? I mean, why do we do this in our cities? Why do we tear down the old in favor of the new? We have no historic foresight. Was it just in 1976 people just weren't looking ahead like that, or they had no respect for it, or we were just part of this, let's go with the new and get it out of here?
I'd say several things. First of all, although I share your sense of loss, I think we're both being romantics if we think things would have been much different. I mean, you know, Americans have been ripping up old buildings and old houses and old roads for 100 years. I mean, you know, this is, you know, I mean, they've taught, if you're a historian, you talk about the tradition of the new. I mean, we just have very, very little sense of preservation. So I think it fits in with this kind of historical set of precedents. If you look at what's going on in the city in the 1970s, this is a period when Frank Rizzo is mayor. Rizzo actually did not want to get into the business of demolishing ballparks. And I won't say he's the good guy in this story, but basically he resists. He would like to have seen it become, you know, I don't know, some kind of rec center or, you know, some kind of little league or semi-pro or amateur stadium complex. And there were various things that people tried to make happen on the site. But it basically was locked up. There were fires there. There's a lot of drug abuse. Gangs used it. A lot of nasty things went on. I mean, you can think of it as a great big old abandoned house, which people found ways of breaking into. So all sorts of unseemly things took place there. And I think finally Rizzo's advisors convinced him that it was a public health hazard, that it would breed crime, and finally, and I'll give you a blander quote, Rizzo finally said, tear the blank, blank, blank thing down. Right. And that's what the city did. And then they had, it wasn't pretty, but it wasn't dangerous. There was just a huge empty field there. And in fact, when I started my research, I tramped that field many, many times. I mean, I've got old broken fungo bats. I've got pieces of steel girder. I've got all the stuff from the the ballpark. In fact, my oldest boy still remembers because I used to take him on these little hikes across 21st and Lehigh, and he couldn't figure out what I was doing because there was nothing there but a load of junk and a great big flat piece of ground. So I guess I'm not sure. I would have been really very, very surprised if anyone had the foresight, as you said, to say, gee, let's hang on to this and, maybe something will become of it that's useful in the future. I have pictures, as you know, of them carting off the facade at the front, the Renaissance architecture. And I still don't know what has happened to that. I tried at one point to find out and couldn't get anyone to tell me whether it had been demolished or whether it was somewhere, somehow.
Yeah, I would like to know that.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
What you seem to be saying though is that Philadelphia with Connie Mack Stadium or Old Shibe Park seem to be experiencing the same social and economic problems as Cleveland and Baltimore, who moved their stadiums out.
Right.
Whereas
that's true.
Those problems did not affect Wrigley Field in Chicago or Fenway Park in Boston. Yeah. So it just wasn't realistic.
I think that what you have to explain, and I don't know the answer to this, is why Fenway and Wrigley were not torn down, because every other place was. I mean, if you go up to Pittsburgh, I mean, I've tried to, they have some kind of memorial there for old Forbes Field, but you can't tell at all. It's just a plaque in the middle of, some other kind of development. At the very least, I will say this, they finally built in the 90s Deliverance Evangelical Church, which occupies basically the same block that Shibe Park used to be on, and there's a blue marker there, and you at least get a sense there in North Philly of the whole square block area in which Shibe Park stood, and you can't get a sense of that, I think, with the Polo Grounds or Ebbets Field or Forbes Field.
That's right. There's a funny story. Before Robin Roberts passed, he told me this. He said that he went and visited that church, and he was speaking with the minister, and he's looking around. And he says, "Well, Reverend," he said, "you and I have something in common." And he said, "What's that?" He said, "We both did a lot of praying on this spot."
That's right.
So, him not to get shelled, I guess. I got one more question for you, Bruce, and it's one that is of particular importance, I think, to us as historians. And I just like to, know what you have to say about it. The Phillies have been criticized for distancing themselves from the city's baseball history. And let me give you an example. There's very little at Citizens Bank Ballpark aside from the Connie Mack statue outside of it to remind fans that the old Athletics were not only the most successful baseball team in the city, but remain the most successful professional sports franchise here to date, having won 5 world championships and 9 pennants.
Yes.
Nor do the Phillies have a history museum with artifacts to honor their own past, like the Yankees, the Reds, the Cards, and other MLB teams do. They have standalone structures to honor their past. Fortunately, there is a group, you might have heard about this, that is planning to build a new $8 million Philadelphia Sports Museum in South Philly and open it in the summer of 2019. So at this point, I guess it really doesn't matter. Do you think the Phillies as an organization appreciate or even understand the significance of the city's baseball tradition to the history of the game?
I don't like trashing the Phillies, but I'm going to. The Phillies, if you go back and look at their history, they've always kind of been behind the eight ball on these issues. I thought there was a chance with the absolutely wonderful run that they had from 2008 through 2011 that they would, that they would see the importance of it. But I don't know what it is. I don't know whether it's because there's a kind of consortium that's run the team for such a long time. When I was writing the book, I dealt a lot with Bob Carpenter and talked to him about this and found him terribly disappointing. I mean, he just didn't seem to me to get it. Although he was he was no longer an owner by then, but he just didn't have he didn't have a sense of it. And my feeling about the Phillies is that they don't have much of a sense of it. And I don't know how you cure them of that, but it's certainly true that the A's had this sense. I mean, for however constricted Connie Mack's ideas were, the Philadelphia Athletics had a wonderful tradition, even though it was foreshortened. I mean, the Phillies are the oldest they go back to 1883, right? In Philly, they're the longest continuing franchise of a major league sports team in a single town. You would think they would want to capitalize on that, but I don't see that they do.
Mm-hmm. Well, listeners, we've been speaking with Bruce Kuklik, author of the book To Everything a Season, Shibe Park in Urban Philadelphia, published in 1991 by Princeton University Press. It is, by my estimation, the best book on Philadelphia baseball. It is one clearly of the top 5 best books on baseball stadiums because it is grounded in a sense, in a context of urban history, which I think is inextricable to understanding these stadiums. You can purchase it online at Amazon.com. Thanks for being with us, Bruce, and thanks for such a wonderful book on Shibe Park. It really inspired me in a lot of the work I did, and I really thank you for it.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for the kind words, Bill.
Absolutely. And thank you, Philly fans, for tuning in. See you next week for another podcast of Philadelphia baseball, past, present, and personal. This is Bill Kashatus, rounding third and heading home on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network.